Hey, House community, and welcome back to House Arrest. This week was another doozy with lots of news and announcements that continue to come in and change our world as we know it. US election results, talks of a potential vaccine, the passing of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, and Jeopardy's Alex Trebek. It's led me to spend some time thinking about legacy. What is legacy, and how do we leave one? How do we each want to be remembered? Today is November 10th, the evening before Remembrance Day, where we honor and remember the individuals who have served and continue to serve Canada during times of war, conflict, and peace. If you're like me and you grew up in a Canadian school system, you'll think of Remembrance Day and remember a somber assembly, memorizing and reciting Flanders Fields, and listening on repeat to A Pittance of Time by Terry Kelly. I swear I'll never forget that music video. But there are more than 2 million individuals, more than 2 million Canadians who have served throughout Canada's history, and more than 100,000 who have lost their lives doing so. I think a question that should be on more people's minds is, where do the Jewish people fit into this statistic? What is our obligation, not only to our Jewish community, but to our Canadian nation that we are so much a part of as well? I always prefer, as you should know by now, stories rather than facts and figures, which is why I've invited two guests onto the show tonight to help us learn and remember together. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest. This is Gabriel Granatstein, Chief Executive Officer of Canada Tire, who, while in university, joined the Canadian Armed Forces as an Army officer. When he returned to Canada, he worked in policy development in the psychological operations field, and then after passing the Quebec bar, became a reserve deputy judge advocate, serving there since 2009. Welcome, Gabriel. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for being here. I feel really honored to have this connection and be able to spend this night together.
Thank you. Me too.
So we do have another guest joining. Hopefully he'll pop on in a couple of minutes, but I'll start with you, Gabriel. Let's start from the beginning. I think, unlike other countries we may be familiar with, obviously Canada doesn't have conscription. So joining the armed forces is a choice, right? How did you make that choice back in university?
I think, it's a really good question. It started before university. In high school, I had a teacher, Guy Sigouin, who was my French teacher, one of my favorite teachers, and he had served in the military. And he spoke to us about his service and what it meant to him. And he always struck me, and still strikes me to this day, as he was kind, warm, disciplined, fair. He had a lot of the qualities that I liked. And in his mind, he seemed to attribute some of those qualities to the military. And then as a student, and I was always very much interested in Canadian history and political science. And you learn about what the Canadian military does and what our role has been throughout history. And it's something that I was proud of, and something I'd always wanted to be a part of. And you get to a certain point where you think about it and you think, okay, well, I'm either going to do this now or I'm never going to do it. And I thought, right, if I don't do this now, I'm going to regret doing it, or not doing it. But if I should try. And so I was in my first year at McGill. And I walked into a recruiting center and applied. And in Canada, it's relatively non-threatening to apply. You can apply as a reservist. You do the same training that the others do. There's no commitment to service for multiple years. You don't sign a contract for your life away, and you can't be ordered to go overseas unless there's a really serious world war. And so, it's a non-threatening kind of way of joining. If you don't like it, you could quit. And so to me, it was like, okay, well, I might as well try it. The risk is low, and I'll see if I can do it.
Huh, interesting. I didn't know that it was sort of not a binding agreement for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, no, if you join the regular forces, what it's called, you do sign a long-term contract, but as a reservist, it's voluntary, and you can choose you do your basic training, and then you can choose to do lengthier contracts. You can choose to deploy overseas like I did, but it's very much based on wanting to do it, and it's very hard to be forced to do anything.
So the characteristics that you describe, that you ascribe to your history teacher, aren't necessarily your French teacher, excuse me, aren't necessarily ones that, you know, I think of when I think of someone in the army, right? Like typically the words that you would associate with the military or the army is aggression and, you know, power and strength. And what was your experience like? What was there sort of this maybe more stereotypical army experience, or more nuanced than that?
I mean, everything in life is more nuanced than it appears in the movies, I would say. Basic training for me that I did in Gagetown, New Brunswick, was, I think, as close to what you would see in the movies as you could expect. Lots of yelling, lots of early mornings and marching and learning how to use firearms and throw grenades and march and drill and things like that. But I think, you know, you have to learn the skills of what it is. I was trained as an officer, and the thing that is drilled into you is, yes, the drill is important, and you know, achieving your mission is important, but the second most important thing is your troops, the people who you care for and who you lead. And I think you learn quickly in the military, especially as an officer, especially when you're young, like I was 21. You know, that there's a number of ways to lead, but the most effective way to lead is not by screaming at people. It's by setting the example. And I think I got to see that from Guy Sigouin, the teacher, who was not leading through authority, he was leading through example. And that was, I think, what was taught to me the most. And I if anybody's from the military is watching this, they'll probably laugh when you quote leadership principles, but the first leadership principle in the military is leading by example. And I think that struck me, and that was something that carried through my training and also my career in the military.
Right. And probably beyond that too. I mean, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of examples in my own life where, you know, the best leaders have been those who, yeah, exactly, just embody the principles they're trying to teach other people.
Yeah, and I think when you go through an experience like that at a younger age, I'm 39 now, and I was 21 when I started. It leaves a mark on you, and there's no job in the world that gives you as much pure responsibility at that young of an age than the military. I mean, at 21, to be responsible for the lives and welfare of 40 soldiers in a platoon or 30 soldiers in a platoon, that's a heavy weight that you don't get when you're working at the Gap, which I was before I joined the Army. So.
Yeah, that was an interesting shift I saw in your career path, for sure.
I wore a uniform at the Gap. I wore a uniform in the Army. It was very similar.
Yeah, more similarities than differences, for sure. Can you talk about some sort of outstanding moments that you look back on? You know, the most rewarding moments, the most challenging ones from your service, and even now as a reserve.
Yeah, sure. I can give you sort of three examples, I guess, that would go through the sort of the timeline of my 17 years in the military, which is a crazy thing that I've been in the military for 17 years. Yeah. I think for me, the most, other than the basic training, which was an event that really marked me, the next job that I had in the military was I taught basic training a few years later, and I got sent I was living in Montreal, and I got sent to Shiloh, New Brunswick, which is a couple hours north of Winnipeg. And there's a large base there. And what was funny, it was very typical of the Canadian Forces. I'm an Anglophone, but I speak French. And they sent me to Shiloh, Manitoba to teach a French basic training course. And so they shipped a whole bunch of people from Quebec, including me, into a very Anglophone environment. And I got to teach a course. So, I mean, teaching basic training was incredibly rewarding. You're taking, 40 recruits who have not had a minute in the military, and you're trying to shape them. And at the time, you have the added responsibility of many of these recruits are going to deploy to Afghanistan. They're not, just going to go back home. So you are really responsible for making sure that they're equipped to survive and to thrive in that environment, and doing it in a very Canadian way, doing it in French in an English environment and dealing with that whole thing. That was intensely rewarding. And even to this day, I see the recruits that I trained, and I know where they've gone and what they've done. And that was a very marking experience for me. I guess that would be the first major experience.
Certainly. So I'm wondering now about the Jewish community, right? Like, you are a Jewish individual who chose to serve and continued to choose to serve the Canadian military. But I think that's quite unusual, right? Like, there were not, hundreds of people I could reach out to join me tonight in commemoration. So where do you think the Jewish community fits into all of this?
It's a great question. I mean, and sometimes when people hear that I was in the army or I'm a veteran, the Jewish people, the automatic assumption is that I was in the Israeli army.
Right.
But I think for me, growing up and learning about what the Canadian military did, and learning about the wars and the deployments, it was always somebody else's son that went to go do that. It wasn't a Jewish family member's son, at least not in Canada. And to me, that never felt right. I mean, it is because people joined the army and people took up arms that World War II ended the way that it did. And so I felt that I had some, if this was in me, I had some responsibility to do it. And when I joined the army, I mean, the great thing about the army is that for the most part, the uniform that you wear and the rank that you have is the only thing that matters. Nobody cares what your religion is, for the most part. Nobody cares what color you are. It doesn't matter. Can you do the job? And that's all that matters. And I never felt any anti-Semitism whatsoever. In fact, the unit that I joined, the honorary colonel, who's usually a veteran, ex-member of the unit, was a man who's passed away a few years ago named David Hart. He was a Jewish decorated soldier from World War II, one of the most decorated soldiers of his time. And he was Jewish, and he was the honorary colonel of our unit. But nobody really cared at the unit that he was Jewish. He was just Colonel Hart, and he was a war hero, and that was it. Right. And for me, my Judaism was not a factor other than trying to get non-pork meals. That was But
it's interesting that you say it wasn't a factor, because from what I'm hearing is your Jewish identity actually informed your decision to join the military. Like, the lack of Jewish participation or however you felt about it, you felt this identifying need to add to the Canadian military as a Jewish individual, if I understand that right.
Yes and no. I felt like whether it was a Jewish individual or whether it was somebody from relatively well-off family living in Westmount, that it shouldn't just be somebody else's son. So I don't know that. I mean, maybe at an underlying level, being Jewish was important, but when I got in, it wasn't a factor, and it didn't even come up in any real way until I deployed overseas to Bosnia as a peacekeeper, and then it became more of an issue, but in a positive way.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because I managed to find a little bit of information on that sort of remarkable experience that you were a part of. So when you were deployed to Bosnia, tell us what sort of Jewish surprise awaited you there.
Yeah, so I was deployed to Bosnia in a town called Bihać, which was a predominantly Muslim area. And for those of you who don't know, Bosnia is part of the former Yugoslavia. There were Christian Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Muslims living in relative harmony until they had a major civil war that, in some ways paralleled the Holocaust. And Canadians had been sent there as peacekeepers for many years, and I was one of a series of Canadians who went there. And my group of Canadians, we were probably about 10 of us, and my job and that of my partners, Jim Houlihan and Matt Burney, we just went out into the community. We met with community leaders. Our job was to really be the eyes and ears of the international forces on the ground, talk to community leaders and see what they had, what they needed, how we could help them if there was tensions or hostilities, and try and mediate them as best we could. And it just happened that there had been and I wasn't aware of this at the time, there had been a Jewish community in the town that I was in up until the Second World War. And I was visiting a community leader, and nobody knew that I was Jewish. And in fact, I had been told that, in a Muslim area where there is potentially some risk, advertising that you're Jewish is probably not a good idea. And so, I visited this community leader, and it turned out that, one of on his wish list of things to do was he had a cemetery in his village that was completely decrepit and had been turned into a trash pit. And it was a Jewish cemetery. And he had been trying for years to get it cleaned up and get funds from the international community to clean up the cemetery. And he didn't know, when he was asking me this through my interpreters, he had no idea that I was Jewish. And it just happened. And because of how we work there and how the international community works there, the government, whether it's Canadian or European Union or whoever, wasn't going to give money to restore the cemetery of one religion over another. That wouldn't have been right. But I think the thing that struck me the most was when I went back to our camp with my colleagues, and we talked about it. Every single person who served with me there wanted to do something to help. And not only the Canadians who served with me who weren't Jewish, but the interpreters who I worked with who were local Bosnians. And, we managed all together to contact the Jewish community in Montreal, where I was from, and some in Toronto. And we managed to collect quite a bit of money to help restore that cemetery. And it was something for the local Muslim community that they were so proud of, and that I was just so proud of, that we could actually do something to make a difference, which can be a challenge as a peacekeeper, to feel like you're actually doing something that makes a difference. And I was so touched by the support, both from at home, but also from, my colleagues, thinking about Jim, who was my partner who was originally from Newfoundland. I don't think he had met a Jewish person maybe before me, let alone done work to restore a cemetery. And I was just so touched that everybody was so into it.
Right, like it's really an unbelievable story. I saw it the first time, and it's just hard to believe, right? It just seems so many things had to fall into place in a certain way so that you could travel to Bosnia and meet this community leader and be introduced to this cemetery that's Jewish cemetery that needed some help, which also sort of leads to what I was talking about before about legacy, right? It's like what you're leaving behind. So what do you hope to leave behind in spending time with us tonight, speaking about your experience and serving in the military and having this as part of your story?
That's a really big question. What do I hope to leave behind? I mean, I think what specifically about the military, a couple of things. My experience in Bosnia, yes, we restored a cemetery, and that was great. But I think the thing that, if I felt like I left a legacy there, it was that for the community there and the dozens or hundreds of people. I was on like local Bosnian TV and radio, and I was the only Jewish person that any of them had ever met in their entire lives. Their conception of Jews was probably not the most positive in that community for reasons we all know, but they had never met anyone. And I think what struck me was A, how welcoming they were, B, how many questions they had, and that I left them with the legacy of saying, we met a Jewish guy and he helped us, and he was wearing a uniform from Canada, and he represented Canada. That, to me, if I made any difference in the perception of our people, then that to me was the legacy that mattered. And in terms of service in general, I don't think that the Army is for everybody, or the Navy or the Air Force. I think you have to be a certain kind of person to enjoy the kind of pain that it can bring. But I think service in any sense is important. And I think about what I got most out of the experience, whether it's Bosnia or teaching recruits, is that what I was doing in the military was not about a profit line or revenue. It was about serving a purpose and serving a group of people, whether it was my soldiers or whether it was a community. And I think that to me was the most important thing. And I think you can do that whether you're serving the Jewish community like you are, or you're serving any community. It doesn't have to be necessarily in a uniform.
Yeah. Thank you. That was great. So obviously Remembrance Day, right? That's why we're here. That's why we're having this conversation. How do you commemorate Remembrance Day, and what crosses your mind on a day like this?
I guess so. What do I think about on Remembrance Day? I usually think about the same person. So when I did basic training, I had an instructor whose name was Sergeant Don Lucas, and he was a really, really good instructor. And you're going through this experience, and it's incredibly intense. And like for me, a city boy, like I've never done any of this stuff. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm terrified. And you're constantly going, and for a while, you're not perceiving that humanity exists because you're just going through this machine. And there was one weekend where we were doing drill outside. So like marching around, and it was like on the weekend, it was like 4 o'clock in the morning. And Sergeant Lucas was there, and he brought his kids with him, and they were sort of off on the parade square, and they were watching us, and they were so proud of their dad. And, in that moment, for me, and I think for others who were with us, it was like, okay, there is humanity in this. Like this person, Sergeant Lucas, is a human being. This is about family. Like it just gave us an inspiring moment. Mm. And a few years later, when I was in Bosnia, Sergeant Lucas was killed in Afghanistan by an IED. And so for me, when I think of Remembrance Day, I think of him because I think it's easy to think of Remembrance Day as what happened a long time ago, soldiers from World War II. But there are hundreds and hundreds of families who are impacted by military service. Sergeant Lucas's family is one of them, and I met them a few years ago at another event. There was a soldier 2 weeks ago, a reservist, who was killed in a training incident out west, which unfortunate accident, but you're training with live bullets. So I think you need to think about the actual people. It's very easy just to go to a parade and stand at attention, but the people matter.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Lastly, before we say goodnight, I'm wondering, is there anything you want to share with our viewers and our Jewish community? Is there any message you want to give, or any sort of lasting thought that's on your mind as we bring in Remembrance Day tomorrow?
I would just say, like, when I was in high school, we had these Remembrance Day ceremonies, and there was always, at the high school that I went to, they published this list of people who had been killed, who had served in the school. And at the school that I went to, there was quite a few. And to me, I was always like looking at the names and trying to figure out who these people actually were. And I think if you can find a way during Remembrance Day to find the name of somebody and find a way to actually remember them and who they were and who their family was, I think that's a good way to remember the day.
Yeah, well, thank you for your time and your service and for sharing your story with us here tonight. Let's just take a moment of silence to remember all those who have served our nation and continue to do so.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gabriel. It's been a really enlightening and wonderful conversation, and yeah, wishing you a meaningful Remembrance Day, and let's all work as a Jewish community to make sure Canada as a nation is a large part of our identity, and to recognize so much that goes into making Canada the place that we call home.
Thank you so much, and thanks for doing this.
All right, have a good night. Thank you.